Hi, everyone, and welcome to our online stuff for week 3. And next page, aha. So today in this video, what we're going to talk a little bit about is 4 big points, like I usually try to do on these online video presentations. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what mobility is, or sort of definitions of mobility. And then we'll talk about different things and the way they move around the world. And we'll talk about concepts of diffusion, which is a certain kind of movement or mobility. And then we'll talk about migration, which of course is the movement of people. And then sort of the 4th big point, which is really kind of brought up more from the other videos that you'll watch with this section, is the idea that migration has been going on for a very long time. As you are probably aware, human beings originated, according to anthropologists, in eastern part of Africa. And so that means that every person that is not in that area moved at some point, right, to other parts of the world. And so we'll talk about just how long migration's been going on by focusing on a particular case study. All right, so first big point, what is mobility? Well, mobility is simply, do I have my definition? Here we are. It's the relative ability of things, people, ideas to move freely through space. Right? Some things are more mobile than others. Also, some people are more mobile than others. But it's easier for some things to move than other things. And as I put up here at the top, it's important to understand how and why different people, things, and cultural elements move through space and how they locate in particular settings when we're trying to understand why certain places are the way they are or why certain things have diffused around the world and other things have not. And that leads us to our next definition here, which is diffusion. And diffusion is a particular kind of movement. It's the movement of people, ideas, or things from one location out towards other locations. So oftentimes people will talk about diseases and diffusion, such as with the coronavirus. People talk about how it originated. Well, it certainly started having an outbreak amongst people in a human population in Wuhan, China. And that's where it started, and then from there it diffused to basically almost every country in the world, except for a few. So that would be an example of diffusion. It's not just movement, sort of random, it's from one place sort of out. And it's not just diseases that do this, ideas do this too. Later in the semester, we'll talk a little bit about religions, right? And some of the major religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all started in very small locations and then spread and diffused around the world. So when we talk about diffusion, there's 3 kinds of diffusion that I want you to know. And I'm going to come back to this diagram here in a second. But the 3 types of diffusion I want you to know is contagious diffusion, hierarchical diffusion, and relocation diffusion. 3. And all right, let me go to this diagram to kind of explain what those 3 are. Contagious diffusion, and I know the word contagious makes you think about diseases, but it's not just diseases here. What this contagious diffusion means is it moves from one person to the next person to the next, sort of smoothly across space. So if we have this person here who has something, and this could be an idea, it could be a disease, it could be an innovation or an invention of some kind. Like say they are a gardener and they figured out some new technique that really makes their tomato plants grow bigger. And if they tell the people across the fence from them, who then tell their neighbors, and then their neighbors, then their neighbors, that would be a contagious diffusion. So it starts from one person and kind of spreads evenly through space, going across space. So that's contagious diffusion. However, that's actually not how most things in the world diffuse. Instead, what we typically find is what's referred to as hierarchical diffusion. And what that means is that somebody has something, an idea. I think for this example, I'll use, like, say, a particular religion and the way that religion might spread through a particular place. Rather than it just being one person telling the next person next to them and the next to them and the next to them, somebody may go to a large, like say they're of a particular religious faith and they're trying to seek converts, and then they go to a city and they might convert people in that major city. And, like some of the ways in which religious conversion has happened around the world is oftentimes kind of the elite or upper classes will convert to religion, and then they'll convert sort of the people below them that have like lower social status. This would be an example of hierarchical diffusion, where somebody has something, goes to one particular point, and then it kind of diffuses from those points. And let me go to this next example here to show this. This is actually a map of the H1N1 pandemic of 2009 that predates the current pandemic by about 10 years. And this was a great example of hierarchical diffusion. So is the coronavirus too, by the way. But essentially what happened is this. The H1N1 began in Mexico City, but it was actually a much bigger problem in parts of Asia and Europe. But what happened was that there were some cases around Mexico City, but it was but relatively close to the international airport. And so travelers that had caught H1N1 then flew to Japan, they flew to Europe, they flew to the United States, and then you started getting these outbreaks of H1N1 around these major cities with international airports. And so eventually you end up with this pattern where the disease itself sort of moved down through what we would call the urban hierarchy. So it wasn't just like it started in Mexico City, then it got the cities close to Mexico City, and then it got to southern and northern Mexico. Like that would be a contagious diffusion. Instead, it skipped and went to these other major cities all around the world, totally skipping areas in between. One of the things you'll notice is that in this case, you can see a pattern pretty obvious that Africa was pretty much untouched by H1N1. And a large reason for that is that in terms of airline routes and people traveling, it tends to be much more isolated from Latin America than is Asia, Europe, or North America. Okay. So that's that idea of hierarchical diffusion. Kind of goes through sort of important cities or important people and then diffuses out from there. The final type of diffusion that you need to know is relocation diffusion. This is where the thing that you're interested in isn't necessarily the thing that's moving, but some person is carrying that to another location. So let me go back to my example of religious conversion. For contagious diffusion, if somebody had this idea of this new religion and they converted people next to them and then they converted people next to them, it would be contagious. If you had somebody who was basically converting the upper classes of certain places and then later they were converting the people below them, that would be hierarchical diffusion. If, however, people of a particular new religion just moved to a new place but didn't convert anyone, this would be an example of relocation diffusion. So for instance, let's say that there was a Christian denomination and they moved into a place where there hadn't been Christians before. Well, now you've got Christians in this particular area, but it's not because anybody was converted, it's because they themselves moved. So an example of this using, say, disease diffusion would be, say, with like coronavirus. If people that had coronavirus, let's say they were only, like early on in the outbreak, it was only in China, right? And so people that came from those areas of China and then went to Thailand and then went to the United States and then went to Japan, all of a sudden you have the disease in those places, but they haven't actually transmitted it to anybody. The reason the disease is there is because the person relocated. Now, what then happened is this hierarchical diffusion where then the people did end up getting other people sick, but the initial diffusion was relocation. Another good example of relocation diffusion, or just thinking about diffusion in general, is actually if you look at, say, musical styles like blues music in the United States. Blues music is different in different parts of the United States traditionally based on where people migrated from and then went to these larger cities where the blues clubs, kind of started back in the 1930s or so. And so an example of this is there are certain types of blues music, East Texas, Mississippi Delta, Piedmont style. All of them sort of originated in different parts of the South. And between the 19 teens to 1930, you had something called the Great Migration, where a lot of African Americans moved out of the American South into the cities of the West and the Northeast and also the upper Midwest. And with this migration, people brought that blues music from those home areas with them. And so typically a lot of the people from the South that moved out west came from this area of East Texas. And so you get that East Texas style of blues in the clubs of places like San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles. Whereas a lot of the folks that moved from Mississippi and these sort of areas brought the Delta style of blues music to the clubs in places like Memphis, Kansas City, Chicago, whereas a lot of the folks that migrated in this time period up to New York City, Philly, etc., brought yet another type of blues music with them. And so you can actually sort of tell where people relocated from by this cultural trait that they brought with them. And so that's the way blues music sort of diffused out of the South into these major cities all around the country. So hopefully that's another good example that it clarifies those three types of diffusion. Another couple things about diffusion that you need to kind of know. One is this idea what they call time-distance decay, which is diffusion typically becomes weaker as some sort of innovation moves away from its point of origin. In other words, the effect of something is going to be bigger closer to where it started. I mean, that just sort of makes sense. However, what's usually interesting is when that's not necessarily the case, like when something becomes very, very popular in places all around the world, not necessarily close to where it started. I had one student in this class do a presentation once on Jersey Club music and how it kind of started in places like Newark, or actually started in Baltimore, oddly enough, and then moved to the clubs in Jersey, around Newark, and then it became very popular in parts of Europe and Japan and other sort of urban areas, but not necessarily in like rural Pennsylvania, which is relatively close to these clubs in Jersey that were playing this music. And so, again, you would usually expect it to sort of have a lesser effect at larger distances, but that's not always the case. And particularly today with the internet and social media and everything else, they've greatly accelerated diffusion. It used to be, like we talk about like blues music. I mean, this took decades to sort of diffuse out of the South and to go to these different places. Once you had radio and then later, TV, internet, etc., now things can diffuse much more quickly because somebody can make up, say, a new musical style today, and it doesn't matter where they are, whether they're in Hong Kong or London or Sao Paulo, and all of a sudden everybody can hear it the next day. But that's, obviously a little different than things were, if you go back, 50, 100 years ago. The other thing with diffusion is that sometimes there are what are called barriers to diffusion. And we typically talk about this in terms of absorbing barriers that really halt a diffusion and permeable barriers that will still allow it in, but kind of slow it down. And so a great example from like a disease perspective with the coronavirus, some countries halted travel in and out of their countries completely very early on in the pandemic. So that was like an absorbing barrier. So the disease did not get there. There are certain countries in the Pacific, for instance, that just shut down entirely, and they still don't have coronavirus in their countries because they had a complete stoppage of travel, and that was an absorbing barrier. It kind of kept the disease from diffusing there. Permeable barriers, when people might have put some travel bans with some restrictions or make people do quarantines, and that might slow down the ability of something to transmit. This also, though, could be in terms of not diseases. If we think of it in terms of, say, music styles or things, sometimes a permeable barrier might be that the song is in a language that you don't necessarily speak. And so you may not necessarily hear some of the newest things that are coming out of songs that are coming out from like French musicians or South Korean musicians or this sort of thing because of the language barrier. Those types of things may not transmit as easily as songs that are done in English per se, like into the United States. So, okay. All right, so a couple other points here. One is just migration. So we're talking about how different things move and that sort of thing. But when we talk about people moving, we have a few different kind of specific terms here. Let's see, where's my term? There they are. So one of them is just the definition of migration, which is the large-scale movement of people between different regions of the world. Typically, when we talk about migration, we talk about international migration, which is that when people kind of cross a border, then we kind of think of it as migration has happened. Which is interesting. Like, for instance, I came to this job here in New Hampshire. Before I was teaching here, I was teaching 5,000 miles away in Hawaii. But I am not considered a migrant, right? Because that was still part of the United States legally. And so nobody considers me a migrant, even though I moved 5,000 miles for this job. All right. Another term is stepwise migration. And stepwise migration just means when sometimes people move, they'll move in a series of steps. So for instance, there's been a lot of migration into Europe from places like Syria and Iraq, and also sub-Saharan Africa. We'll watch one of the videos you'll see later, talks a little bit about this, like trying to move into the European Union, like into Spain. And oftentimes this will be a series of steps. If you're coming from central parts of Africa or West Africa, you might try to get to Morocco. And then from Morocco, you might try to get into Spain. And then once you're in Spain, you may end up then trying to go to Germany. And so it's kind of you take these steps in migration. And again, this is something that you'll see in one of the videos that talks about Melilla in Spain, which is an area that migrants have been kind of trying to get into. And so when people try to think about why so many people are trying to migrate, or have been, obviously it's kind of gone down since the pandemic started, there's a lot of different reasons, but usually it's fairly complex. You'll see sometimes out there a lot of single explanations that try and say, well, people are all migrating because of this reason or that. But usually it's a confluence of different types of reasons. And we typically will divide these into two types of factors, what we call push factors and pull factors. Push factors are things that are making you kind of want to leave the area that you're in, and pull factors are the things that are pulling you towards a particular place. So in, for instance, migration into Europe, you have both of these things going on. You have, wars going on in Syria and Iraq, and also in Nigeria and other parts across the Sahel of Africa. That's pushing people out. Or you may have just like low economic opportunities. That's kind of pushing you. They may be being drawn to Europe at the potential of finding jobs, or having, areas that are safer, or having access to healthcare or education. These sort of things would be pull factors. Typically, the major reasons why people move tend to actually be push factors. However, oftentimes people in the receiving areas where migrants are moving to believe that migrants are coming because of the pull factors. Like a lot of times in like debates around migration in the US, people think that a lot of people are trying to move here to get jobs, or, to just sort of take advantage of the particular, good things around the quality of life that you can get in a place like Europe or in North America. But if you actually talk to most of the migrants, the major reasons is usually push factors. Typically, people will tend not to move unless you kind of really have to. And most folks probably are aware of this, as anyone who's had to even move up to go to college or whatever knows. Moving is a hard thing to do. It's particularly hard if you don't have a lot of money or a lot of resources. And so it's not something that people typically take on, they don't take it on unless they absolutely feel like they have to, because they're being pushed out of some of the places that they're from. So you'll see this a little bit in one of the videos, the one on Spain, that's with this section, which is there. And then, of course, there's a large amount of migration going on around the southern United States-Mexico border as well. Just moving my picture here. But one of the things you'll notice here is that actually it's been in pretty sharp decline since about the year 2000 in terms of migration. And it is, to keep in mind, too, a very, very long border with some existing, areas of fencing, but a lot of areas that are not, even still. Okay, so last kind of section here for this video, which is, I just want to set up the video you're going to watch about Nathan and Oscar's kind of adventure, where they trace back their lineage from New Zealand back to Taiwan across the Pacific. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this video is it kind of shows kind of a human side to very, very old migrations. Like, how did people make it out to the Pacific Islands thousands of years ago? In this video, they're going to show kind of how people came and populated these islands, which were some of the last areas on Earth to have human populations. New Zealand was actually the last island that humans, have reached and had a permanent settlement. Obviously, it was a little after that people got to Antarctica and stuff, but nobody technically permanently lives there. So, but one of the key points is that the Pacific area has a lot of islands in it. Sometimes it's not necessarily really obvious because it's not very, it's fairly common that you'll see a map of the Pacific and it'll just be empty. It'll just be a big blue ocean expanse and you don't actually see the particular islands. So I think it's important to kind of note that there are actually thousands of islands with millions of people that live all around the Pacific Islands. And so when you see this video, you'll kind of see that, because the video starts here in New Zealand, and then they will go up here to the Cook Islands, to Samoa, and then I believe to Vanuatu, and then up here to Taiwan, kind of showing how people migrated. And so one of the key things that this video will get into is they'll be talking mostly about Polynesian migration. And Polynesia is sort of it's the European name for this area of the Pacific. When Europeans came into the Pacific as explorers, they noticed that there were some differences among the different peoples that they encountered, and came up with the not very creative at all names of Polynesia, which means many islands, Micronesia, which means small islands, and Melanesia, which means black islands. And essentially this had to do with the fact that people in this area had darker skin color. There was a lot of islands out here, and a lot of the islands here were small. So these are not categories that people in these areas actually picked for themselves. They're European categories kind of placed into the region. But one of the interesting things about this area is that if you go to Melanesia or Micronesia, there's a lot of cultural diversity. The languages are very different, the ethnicities are different. You can even travel from one valley to the next in Papua New Guinea and encounter completely different languages, hundreds of languages across this area. But then what European explorers were really kind of puzzled by is that when they got out here to Polynesia, where the islands are really far apart, they noticed that things were actually very, very similar. The languages that you see in Hawaii and New Zealand and Easter Island, also known as Rapa Nui, but also French Polynesia like Tahiti, Cook Islands, like you'll see in the video, that all of these languages were almost identical. And so what that probably meant is that these people had been in contact with each other and had also kind of diffused from some common source relatively recently, because languages tend to shift and change over time. But Europeans couldn't figure out how did people kind of get across this big area in boats a long time before Europeans had technology to do this. And there were a lot of different theories about this for a long time. And one of the main theories is the idea that, humans had crossed over the Bering Land Bridge here into North and South America, and that people were fishing off the coast of South America. And this is a map showing the way the wind and the currents go. And that essentially they were fishing offshore and they got blown off course, and the winds and the currents took them from South America into the islands like Tahiti and Fiji and other areas, sort of by accident. They were blown off course and landed, and then ended up kind of creating populations. And then they kept kind of doing this by accident, being kind of blown by the wind. And this theory was really put forward by a guy named Thor Heyerdahl, who was a Norwegian anthropologist. And his name's Thor. He's from Norway. And his idea was, hey, he noticed that there was a lot of similarities in the cultures of South America and the cultures of the Pacific. So he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a boat. And he did. A simple one, and set it off from the coast of Peru and let it drift and see what ends up happening. And sure enough, he crashes into French Polynesia near Tahiti and says, aha, see, this is what must have happened. However, just because you can get carried with the current from South America to the Pacific doesn't mean that's how it actually happened. Strangely, Thor's grandson redoes this journey again in 2006. However, the problem is that Thor was totally wrong. That people actually came from the other direction. And the reason we know this, and this is what the movie will get into, is that, the reason we know this is that you can trace back through genetic research, as well as through looking at pottery and other kinds of artifacts, as well as looking at languages and how they changed over time. And people were able to piece together that what happened is this area through Australia and Melanesia was actually settled many, many tens of thousands of years ago. But fairly recently, at around 4000 BC, about 6,000 years ago, a group of people that had amazing sailing skills came out of Taiwan, came down through these areas, intermarried with people in Melanesia, but kept sailing outward to Fiji, to Samoa, paused for a little while there, like a couple thousand years, and then developed sailing technology that was able to get them essentially everywhere else in the Pacific. They came out to this area, then they went backwards, or since back down towards New Zealand, towards Easter Island, up towards Hawaii. And if you're wondering how did they find all this stuff without running into North and South America, the fact is that they did run into North and South America. There is now a substantial amount of anthropological evidence showing that long before Columbus came to the Americas, that Polynesian voyagers actually came to places like Santa Barbara and the coast of South America as well. And this was important because it also showed how there was actually trading going on across this vast area pre-European contact. And one way they know about this was a type of pottery called lapita, which looks like this, and they talk about this in the video a little bit as well, kind of as evidence that there had been these migratory routes of people thousands of years before Europeans came into the area. And then another piece of evidence was what they, was DNA research. Essentially, in your cells, you have two kinds of DNA. You have cellular DNA, which you get from your mother and your father. You have mitochondrial DNA, which you only get from your mother. And then she only gets it from her mother, and so on and so on. And because of that, you can actually trace back one particular line of your lineage really, really far. And by measuring the types of mutations that occur in people's DNA, both mitochondrial and cellular DNA, they can tell when different populations sort of split off from each other. And this is the basis of the video where these two guys kind of go back and look at their lineage over history by traveling to these different places coming from New Zealand. Another thing to kind of comment on here is that even though some people were surprised that people would explore against the wind, the fact of the matter is that you actually want to explore against the wind because it's the safest thing to do, because if you go out and it doesn't work out, you can always get back. And that's one reason why it actually wasn't, like Thor said, kind of being blown with the wind. It actually was people going against it. The other thing about this is that people would sometimes know where islands were because they would see birds that they knew landed on their island that, walked around and would, use land to nest. They would take off and they would fly towards the horizon. So even if the island was hundreds or even thousands of miles away, you knew that if that bird had to land at some point, follow the trajectory of where those birds were going in your boat, and eventually you would probably find an island. If any of you have seen Moana, you also know that this is part of the story, right, around voyaging in the Pacific. Okay, so the last point here that I want to make is sort of why is it important about whether Thor Heyerdahl was right or how people did their migration across the Pacific. Well, this was actually became a very, very important sort of political thing going on in the Pacific for many years, because these Western anthropologists had been saying, well, these people were not smart enough or technological enough to be able to sail out to these areas all across the Pacific. So it must have been done on accident because they're, quote, primitive people. And the people in these areas were like, no, that's not true. We were voyagers and we, knew how to do these things and had these really great techniques. And, you're not giving us credit. And one of the things that sort of indicates this is, it's interesting. I don't know if anybody has been to the Museum of Natural History in New York City, but it's a pretty cool museum. But it's a little problematic in a few ways. Like on one floor, you have dinosaurs and you have all sorts of different animals. And this is one floor of that museum. African mammals, reptiles and amphibians, primates, which is like, apes and that sort of thing. And then you get Native Americans and Pacific peoples and their art and their cultural artifacts. Whereas, so are the Europeans in here? No, their art and cultural things are over at the Museum of Modern Art or other kinds of things, other places in New York. But for some reason, people that are from native of North America or the Pacific are deemed to be so primitive, they are put on the same floor with primates and amphibians. And this is definitely a problem in terms of how these people are represented as being sort of, in a sense, less than human and more like animals. And so this push to this push to sort of recognize this history of voyaging was very, very important. And so when you're watching that video, just kind of keep those things in mind, that migration's been going on for a long time. And also I just wanted to mention there's 3 words that you may hear that you may not necessarily know because they're sort of Maori words from New Zealand. One of the terms is Aotearoa. Aotearoa is just the indigenous name for New Zealand. So sometimes they'll talk about Aotearoa. That's just the indigenous name for New Zealand. The other term that they sometimes will talk about is Pakeha, and Pakeha basically just means a white person. So one of the characters is part Maori. Maori is the indigenous people of New Zealand, and one of his parents is Maori, and one of his parents is Pakeha, so kind of white European. The other term they'll use quite a bit is waka, and waka is a name for like a large canoe, but it's also sort of the name of your tribe or your small group. And so people will talk about what their waka as kind of where they come from as sort of their people, but also like the canoe that brought them to Aotearoa. So, all right, that's it. And I hope you enjoyed the other videos, and I will see you in class.